Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is the Program on Education Policy and Governance Conference on School Choice in the Post-Pandemic Era. We appreciate your time. I will now turn it over to our director, Professor Paul Peterson. Paul?
Thank you, Antonio. Antonio Wentland is the Associate Director of our program and has helped with the organization of this conference. I am Paul Peterson. We at PEPG are excited to have so many people joining us for today's session. Research on school choice has played an important role in the assessment of charters and vouchers and what's happening in school districts. Recent expansion of school choice is presenting scholars with new opportunities. The fact that school districts are creating what's known as portfolio districts or areas within the school district that provide families with choice of schools is a new opportunity to see if choice actually is effective on the ground. Supplementing the work that's been done on charters and private school choice for many years. So what does the latest research say about school choice? We're very fortunate to have some answers to these questions from three scholars who are looking at all three sectors, district, private, and charter, in today's session. Before we turn to our speakers, I wish to recognize Nick Tavares and Michael Poor have helped with the conference and want to urge you to look at any recordings of previous sessions that you may have missed, that they are now available on the PEPG website, as will this one be as soon as it can be processed for that purpose. Daniel Hamlin, a professor of education at the University of Oklahoma, has played a major role in the organization of this conference. He's an expert on school choice, and he will be co-moderating today's session. So Daniel, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Well, I'm going to go ahead and just turn to our panelists so we can get started. So our first panelist is Christopher Campos. He's an assistant professor at the University of Chicago. He focuses on the economics of education and is an expert on intra-district school choice. Our next panelist is Marcus Winters. He is associate professor in the College of Education at Boston University, and he's published a vast amount of research on charter schools and test scores, principal turnover, special education, and many other areas of charter school choice. And then finally, we have Patrick Wolf, who is distinguished professor of education policy and 21st century endowed chair in school choice at the University of Arkansas. And he's, of course, performed some of the most widely cited experimental analyses of school choice. And he's also the author of School Choice, Separating Fact from Fiction. So before we begin, as usual, we want to hear from you. So please do post your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. And if you would keep your questions brief, we don't need a lot of context. That will help Paul and I to locate the question and pose it to the panelists. So we're going to get started. We'll have each of the presenters will present first, and then we'll move into the broader Q&A. And so we'll have ample time for connecting with the presentations to the audience questions. So why don't we get started then? And Chris, if we could start with you first, that would be great. Chris, I think you might be muted.
I always still do that over a year into the pandemic. Okay, great. So thanks everyone for having me. Today I'm going to talk about a project that was a chapter in my dissertation that I just wrapped up this past May at UC Berkeley. And it's about a public school choice program. And so the way I like to motivate this kind of paper is that just to highlight, as you may know, that school choice reforms are increasingly popular across the United States. And one statistic that I like is one that came out of the National Household Education Survey in 2016 that was finding that roughly 1 in 5 students were choosing their school as opposed to being assigned their school. And this is public school choice. So these are students that were opting for charters, magnets, or other types of intra-district school choice policies. And so As you may know, charter schools, at least in the public setting, get a lot of attention, but intra-district school choice policies are also increasingly common. So for example, in Los Angeles in the early 2000s, there was roughly 150 magnet programs. In the most recent year, there's roughly 300, right? So there's been a surge in kind of this demand or apparent demand and supply of magnet programs in LA, but there's other also novel controlled choice programs that are being experimented with across the country. And another thing I want to point out is that the political economy of choice usually puts district stakeholders against school choice proponents, but intra-district policies can also provide students access to more effective schools, provide parents the ability to choose schools that best suit their students' needs, and also potentially induce competitive effects. So all the things that we tend to like about school choice or that motivate school choice reforms, we can think about them also existing within just the public school district side of the market. And so we're going to study what we consider a novel intra-district school choice reform in Los Angeles. So let me just quickly tell you about it. So in 2012, LAUSD was considering eliminating all attendance zone boundaries. They quickly realized that that was not going to be politically feasible. So instead, they created 16 zones of choice that provide a total of 96 schooling options across these zones. And so what they essentially did for the most part was combine catchment areas into multi-school zones of choice. So before the reform, you were assigned one school in your neighborhood. After the reform, you had several nearby options, but your options were still limited based on where you lived, right? So it wasn't fully free choice, it's some restricted controlled choice program. And if we look at the school board minutes, they were concerned with kind of typical things people mention when they motivate school choice reforms, such as access to high performing schools and improving student school match quality. And so this reform is large. It covers roughly 30 to 40% of high school students in LAUSD. Most of these students are low income and classified as Hispanic by the school district. So roughly 90% are classified as poor, roughly 90% of them are classified as Hispanic. So very segregated in terms of income and race. And that's kind of some context that we can return to in a few minutes. And so I'll show you a map of where these zones were. This program is run by a team in the district headquarters that they have field administrators that are tasked with informing parents about their options and kind of are the primary point of contact with parents who are kind of interacting with the program. And so, like I said, kind of your residence, where you live, determines whether you're eligible for the program and whether or not you can participate and your options, right? And so parents participate by submitting rank ordered list, ranking all the options in their zone. And because this is a neighborhood-based expansion, it ensures parents' choice set is not too large, which is also kind of an interesting component of this program. Because if we think about a setting like New York, where parents face a similar decision, there they have hundreds of potential options to choose from, and that could be overwhelming. Here, parents have at most 5 campuses they can rank. And one last feature of the policy that we won't spend too much time on is in the assignment process, there's lotteries that are embedded and that kind of randomizes some students into popular schools and lotteries some people out, but I won't spend too much time on that. So let me quickly show you a map of who this reform covered. So this is LA County, or kind of a portion of LA County that LAUSD covers. These polygons are census tracts, and they're filled in according to the census tract median income quartile across LA. So a yellow tract is a tract in the top 25% or the top quartile, and a purple tract is one in the bottom quartile. And these red polygons that are overlaid on top of this map are where the zones of choice boundaries are. So you're going to see they're overlaid in particularly disadvantaged neighborhoods of LA County, so downtown, South and East LA, one in the San Fernando Valley, and some very far south in Narbonne. So very disadvantaged neighborhoods. Other parts of the district that are relatively more advantaged, such as the West Side or the San Fernando Valley, are not going to be affected as much by this reform. So you can also think about this as a place-based reform, where these are the portions of the district that were struggling the most. And we're going to see if introducing choice into that part of the district can produce differential improvements for kids in those neighborhoods. And so what we find that the program eliminated achievement and four-year college enrollment gaps. So students' achievement increased by roughly 20% of a standard deviation. College enrollment also increased by roughly 5 percentage points. And that's roughly 25% of the baseline mean, so the college enrollment rate before the policy reform. And so let me just kind of show you some figures. And so here, these are kind of the treatment effects I'm talking about. What I'm reporting here are kind of the effects of the program at different points in time. So the first thing I want to emphasize is that in the years leading into the policy, which is year 0, where this line is at, it doesn't seem to be the case that students enrolled in zones of choice schools were trending any differently in terms of their achievement growth compared to students that not enrolled in ZOZ schools. And then kind of after the program is introduced, you kind of don't see much in the first year. And then there's this gradual improvement in student achievement, leveling out at roughly 20% of a standard deviation in the most recent, last year that I have data for, which this would be 2019. We can look at college enrollment, same thing, kind of no evidence of differential trends and this kind of gradual improvement. So this seems to indicate that this program seemed to have lifted student achievement and college enrollment rates. So let me just go back. And so we find that most of the improvements are due to changes in school quality and what I refer to as school quality is school value added. And so essentially all of the effect that we found in that preceding slide is due to changes in value added as opposed to changes in student school match quality. So if you thought that maybe parents were choosing schools that particularly suited their children's needs, then you would expect some kind of larger improvements in student school match quality. We don't find any evidence of that. Instead, we find that school value added increased substantially and it can account for roughly 85% of the effects we find. We also show in kind of the full paper that competition is a key channel explaining the effects. The way we do this is by deriving a competition index, and then we show the schools that were exposed to the most competition at the start of the program are the ones that improve the most. And so that's kind of some piece of evidence supporting this competitive effects hypothesis. And the last piece of evidence that's very important for context is that we find by studying parents' choices, we find that their choices seem to suggest they value effective schools or they value value added, even after we condition on kind of the school's peer composition or the peer quality. And what this is saying is that parents were incentivizing schools to compete on value added. And the schools responded by kind of changing what they were doing that was subsequently impacting student learning. And so these preference estimates help rationalize the changes in school quality we find elsewhere in the paper. So those are kind of the main takeaways. Let me just spend a quick minute just talking about some important institutional features. So one point I like to make about this paper is that it's not just about choice and competition. Institutional support matters for both the demand and the supply side. So those field administrators are playing an important role ensuring parents are well informed when they're making decisions about where to enroll their children. At the same time, they're also serving as weak monitoring devices. And there's another kind of related literature that seems to suggest that performance monitoring can increase productivity. So that's why we think that the role of the field administrator is very important here. And we can think about this also coming up and moving to opportunity experiments, where when families had some type of institutional support, they chose kind of better neighborhoods. Same thing going on, somewhat similar in the zones of choice setting. Like I said before, choice overload is not a salient issue. So this kind of really makes us think about potentially overwhelming parents and implementing school choice reforms that can avoid this type of friction. And one last piece of contextual thing for this program is that these zones are very segregated in terms of race and income. There's kind of other literatures that tend to document kind of potential negative effects of kind of being enrolled in very segregated schools. And so that is something to just be aware of and a potential trade-off in the long run. So yeah, this reform just basically shows that a neighborhood-based school choice expansion reduced within district achievement and four-year college enrollment gaps. In the paper, we find various pieces of evidence supporting a competitive effects story among public schools in a large school district. But I think this paper, what it really does is just pose more questions than it answers. So one thing we're not quite able to nail is what really changed within these schools. And for that, we're going to need more qualitative and quantitative evidence. And one thing that I've become particularly interested in is what incentives do public schools respond to? There's a lot of people that would believe that kind of the schools have no incentive to adjust in response to competition because a lot of these schools aren't going to close. And so what I've been thinking about lately is principals' career concerns. And career concerns could be driving incentives in the public school sector and in the public sector more generally. And so that's all I have for today. If you all have questions, I'm glad to answer them, or you can move on to the next presenter.
Thank you very much, Chris. Now we'll turn to Marcus.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Thanks for having me here today. I'm really excited to be part of this panel. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a paper. It's joint work with Colin Shanks, who's a former graduate student here at BU and is now working in the private sector, and Allison Gilmore, who's an associate professor at Temple University. And we're broadly looking at so charter schools, how parent preferences, and how that relates with student mobility. There we go. So the issue we're up to here and is less about estimating the charter schools' impacts on student outcomes, which is something we've also done in New York and some other places. But I'm going to focus on a different question that I've been interested in my work for a while, which is kind of understanding enrollment patterns and how charter schooling impacts where people are going to school and student movement across the system. So we're really looking at, so do charter schools influence, and one of the important parts of this is, are charter schools influencing the type of students that they serve, which we might be interested in for a variety of reasons. So it might be, so I guess I'd argue it might be the most persistent criticism of charter schools is that they're failing to serve all students, which is something that is commonly said that traditional public schools need to do, right? All students who come, the public schools will serve, charter schools won't serve them for a variety of reasons. We know that charter schools can't really influence their students that receive seats among applicants, right? Because when there's too many students applying for too few seats in charter schools, we assign students in the charter schools randomly, right? So they can't influence student enrollment through that mechanism. But there are at least two ways where we think like maybe they could. The first is what we call cream skimming, right? So this idea that students who are seeking enrollment in charter schools, they tend to be higher performing, they're less likely to have a disability or be learning English than our students in surrounding districts. Now, that could happen because students with those characteristics are just less interested in charter schooling for a variety of reasons. It could also happen if charter schools aren't trying to enroll those students or are finding ways to encourage them not to enroll. That's one of the major concerns we have about charter school enrollments. The other thing that could be happening is this issue of push out. So we might worry that charter schools are systematically encouraging low-performing students or students who are otherwise struggling in order to leave their school. And this is something that we've focused on for a long time within the charter literature. And this is where my focus is going to be of this paper. The cream skimming issue is really, really interesting. It's not going to be our focus. What we're going to focus on is this question of, does it look like charter schools are pushing out students that they're enrolling? And we have prior evidence on this. And it's all trying to address this question of, does enrolling in a charter school make it more likely that a student's going to change schools later on? One way we can look at this is through anecdotes, right? So there are lots and lots of anecdotal reports from students who were inappropriately removed, either directly or indirectly, indirectly encouraged to leave their charter school. You can think of a lot of high-profile cases in New York City and in other places. There's lots of individual cases of this, and honestly, there's enough of these claims that I really have no doubt that at least several of them are credible, right? That sometimes charter schools have inappropriately found ways for students to leave. I also think that probably happens within the public school system as well. But the question from the policy perspective, though, is that systematic enough within that it's explaining charter school enrollments, or is it a series of isolated incidents that happen in some charter schools and get a lot of attention? The other way we can look at this is through descriptive analyses. So descriptive analyses of administrative enrollment data, right? We can follow students within the data over time, and what those analyses have found in a variety of different places, we tend to find that similar students, observationally similar students, are either as likely or less likely to leave their school if it's a charter school than they are to leave a traditional public school. So when we look at student movement across the systems, it also doesn't seem to be consistent with this idea that charter schools are pushing students out. But one limitation of that line of work is it could be that there are differences in student mobility because there are differences in students attending charter and public schools, right? So is this caused by charter school enrollment? Or for example, English learners in charter schools might have higher English proficiency or be closer to English proficiency than the average in public schools, for instance. Are there other things that could be driving this? There's very limited evidence trying to estimate the causal effect of enrolling in a charter school on student mobility. We have some evidence from lotteries, mostly from Boston, finding that enrolling in a charter school causes a drop in the probability that students leave for another school. But frankly, we have very few estimates of this, and they're really located in a single place. One, we need to know that from other places as well. We also don't really understand the mechanisms by which that might be happening. And that's what we're going to try to add into here in Newark. So we're going to analyze student mobility in Newark, New Jersey, has a large and highly effective charter school sector. And we're going to make two important contributions, I think, to understanding charter school mobility. One is that first, we're just going to provide new causal estimates for does enrolling in a charter school make it more or less likely that a student is going to change schools again within the next 2 years. And then the second thing we're going to do is we're going to take advantage of an aspect of how students are assigned to schools in Newark in order to give some new insights on the mechanisms. In particular, we're going to separate out the independent effect of a charter school from the fact that students attending charter schools are going to schools that they highly preferred. And we're going to show that that's an important part. So I'm going to quickly walk through a little bit how school choice in Newark works. So Newark operates a centralized universal enrollment system that applies a deferred acceptance algorithm to try to assign students to all the traditional public schools and to most charter schools. So I should say that the estimates that we have here are really specific to the majority of charter schools that participate in this system. Our results don't seem to be driven, though, by the fact that some charter schools are not participating. And the long story short, so students are assigned by an algorithm that takes into account the parents' preferences for where their kid will go to school, the school's preferences for things like siblings, living in a certain neighborhood and other aspects, and also a random lottery number. So I'll say the paper has more details on how all this works and how we're going to use this for estimation. I'm happy to talk about this more on the panel, but I don't want to spend too much time on it here. For our purposes, what's important? So there's two things that's important about our data. First is that because we see how students are assigned, we can generate a probability that a student is assigned to a charter school. And this is going to allow us to produce lottery-like estimates for the causal effect of enrolling in a charter school. And we're going to look at the effect of enrolling in a charter school on student mobility here. The other thing that we see within these data is each parent's school assignment preference. Right, so this is different than like a one-off lottery in New York City or in Boston, where you apply to a charter school, you might apply to many charter schools, you win some lotteries, you lose some lotteries, and then you figure out where you're going to go. Here in Newark, we get to see, I want my first preference is for my kid to go to KIPP. My second preference is for them to go to the public school down the road. My third preference, on, and we'll be able to take advantage of that for our estimation. So just briefly, the overall findings, what do we find? First, with these causal estimates, we find that charter enrollment reduces student attrition, and pretty dramatically. So all else equal, when we compare student attrition, if they go to a charter school, to compare to how they would have done, what would have happened had they not gone to a charter school, enrolling in a charter school reduces the probability of students going to change schools within the next 2 years by about 22 percentage points. It's a very, very large effect. And shows up for students overall. It also shows up when we look at some heterogeneity that we might care about, right? So this argument that students are being pushed out because they're low performing or they have disabilities, we don't see that within the paper. When we compare like students in this causal method, what we find is that also students with disabilities and students who are not yet proficient in English. We also look at students who are low performing in English or math at the time of entry. We also see that those students are less likely to leave their school if they get into a charter than they would have otherwise. But why is this the case? And that's the next thing that we're going to try to add here. And what I think is a little bit unique about what we can do is that because we can observe the parents' preferences, we can separate out the effect of going to a highly preferred school from the effect of going to a charter school. And what we find is that charter enrollment reduces attrition primarily, but not exclusively, because parents prefer them. So charter schools in Newark, and this is going to be the case in most other places with high-performing charter sectors, the charter schools are among the most highly preferred schools within the city. So, and what that means is that we can't really, when you're going to a charter school, there's some impact of the charter schooling part. There's also the impact that this is a school that I'm going to on purpose. And because of what they're offering is what we think. And so what we can do is we can estimate models following our process from before, but now we're going to control for the preference order of the school to which the student was assigned. So what this is going to do is it's going to disentangle the effect of enrolling in a charter itself from the effect of enrolling in a preferred school. And what do we find? What we find is that assignment to a highly preferred schools accounts for about 2/3 of the charter school impact on student attrition. So again, we find that overall going to charter school reduces the likelihood you're going to change schools, but about 2/3 of that is because if you're enrolling in a charter school, you're probably going to one of your top preference schools, which is one of those results we weren't looking for that when we started this paper, but once we found it, it made lots of sense, right? Parents are in the school that they want to be in, so they're just less likely to leave, though there does remain still a statistically significant effect from enrolling in a charter. So again, enrolling in a charter school reduces the probability of changing schools in the near future, and that's largely because they enrolled in that charter school on purpose. Now, it's worth saying from a policy perspective, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to separate the effect of choice from the effect of charter schooling because they are part of the same thing. But in order to understand the mechanisms by which charter schools are having this impact, we think that's the real insight that we're gaining here. So just quickly to finish up. So the overall implications we see of this is that, I mean, first and foremost, the ever persistent claim that charter schools are systematically pushing out students, and especially high performing charter schools within high performing cities are just pushing out students. It's just simply not consistent with the evidence that we see from the enrollment data. There are anecdotes of it, and those anecdotes, many of which are real and deserve to be followed up on and action taken when schools act inappropriately, whether that's a charter school or a traditional public school. But that said, when we actually look at the numbers, it just simply doesn't show up in the data that charter schools look to be systematically pushing out students overall, and also lower performing students or students with disabilities, the students that are often accused of being pushed out of those schools. The next thing is we just want to make the point that we need to keep in mind, I think, and sometimes we lose this, that school choice is an essential component of charter schooling, right? So we do a lot of focus, and I think also appropriately, when we try to understand what's the impact of what makes a charter school highly effective or less effective, right? We see large variability within the sector. We spend a lot of attention on, is it a no excuses school, quote unquote, or do they have longer school days? What's going on into the school? What our results suggest is there's something also about the choice aspect of this, right? And it could have implications for how we think about choice and student matches into schools overall. And so that's something we're interested in kind of keeping a poke at within other systems as well. All right, I'm about a minute over my time, so I'll end there. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you, Marcus, and thank you for keeping to the time. Okay, now we'll turn to Pat Wolf.
All right. Well, thank you, Dan, and I'm delighted to be here. What I'm going to be presenting is a slight update to information from a paper that I wrote at the direction of Paul Peterson last summer. And today is actually the 32nd anniversary of the completion of the first paper I ever wrote at the direction of Paul Peterson back in 1989. So I've been writing papers at the direction of Paul Peterson for many years and many papers. Eventually, I hope to produce something that's decent. But I'm happy to share with you what I've done so far with this one. So it's a study and a summary and overview of the effects of private school choice on student outcomes. So what is private school choice? It's really any program that provides financial assistance to families to help them access private schools of choice for their students. And currently, these programs come in 4 flavors. There's the traditional school voucher and town tuitioning programs, 29 of them. The first one having been established in Vermont in 1869. There are tax credit scholarship programs, 26 of them across the country. First one was the now massive Florida tax credit scholarship program. Then there are voucher designed education savings accounts. There are 8 of those programs. The first one was in Arizona, established in 2011. And the new kid on the block is tax credit funded ESA's 2 programs. The first one was Kentucky's sort of revolutionary tax credit ESA program that was established this year. So collectively, that's 65 different private school choice programs located in 30 states, plus the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. So this is a modified chart from EdChoice, and it's showing the student participation in these various forms of private school choice programs over the last 20 years. The pink line is for the combined ESA programs. The orange line is for voucher type programs, and the light green line is for tax credit scholarship programs. And when you stack them all up, in the previous academic year, over 600,000 students were attending private schools of choice with the support of public resources. So critics of school choice often say, yeah, private school choice is going to destroy the public school system. This is a graphic of private school market share over the last 20 years, since private school choice programs first started growing around 2001 till the last year when good data were available, 2017. And the caps, the orange caps on top of the bars, represent the students who were being supported by a private school choice program. So the private enrollments supported by private school choice programs, and the blue bars are fee-paying students. And we can see that, to the contrary, basically, the private school sector has been bleeding market share for the last 2 decades. And really all that private school choice programs have done is allowed them to stabilize their enrollments nationally at a little less than 5 million students. Now, when COVID hit, there was a closing of nearly 100 private schools in the spring of 2020 because of the enrollment and financial impacts of the pandemic. But basically, because of public policies, especially the Paycheck Protection Program, private schools that did stay open after the spring and summer of 2020, for the most part, have remained open until now. And in fact, some new private schools have opened. So it looks like, coming out of the pandemic, yes, the private school sector is going to shrink in enrollment somewhat, but not as dramatically as they would have without the support of private school choice programs and the Patient Protection Program. So what effects do these private school choice programs have on student outcomes? Let's start with achievement effects, effects on test scores. And there have been 23 studies of the effect of various private school choice programs on reading outcomes for students. Here I'm presenting the findings from the final year of each of those 23 studies. And otherwise you really couldn't digest all this information. So the key is the extreme right column and the color coding that I provided, which is, if there's no shading, it is a statistically significant positive effect of the program on reading outcomes. If there is light gray shading, the main finding was null, no statistically significant difference between the choice kids and the comparison group. And if it's darkly shaded, if it's dark gray shade, it means statistically significant negative effects on reading outcomes. There are only 3 of those out of the 23 studies. If we look at the math, the studies of math effects of private school choice, we see 4 statistically significant negative findings and then a variety of null and positive findings. But we really see some interesting trends if we break out the findings and group them by research era and by research methodology. The results from the gold standard experimental studies are somewhat more positive than the results from the quasi-experimental studies, but the big difference is by research era. So here we're looking at a certain, just a plain vote count of the results for the studies through the year 2012. And importantly, there were no findings of statistically significant negative effects of school choice on test scores for these 30 initial findings. But when we look at the studies since 2012, we see a much more mixed bag. So instead of neutral to positive, which was the range for the early studies, we really see a mixed bag with somewhat of a negative tilt, a neutral to negative tilt. Only 4 positive findings, 7 statistically significant negative findings, especially in math. So let's look at educational attainment. In addition to looking at test score effects of choice, we want to know the effects that participation in a private school choice program has on achieving certain educational benchmarks, such as high school graduation, college enrollment, college graduation. So this is a photo of my beautiful family, and we are celebrating the graduation of our son, Alex, from the University of Arkansas. And when our children graduate from high school or college, we throw parties. And we throw parties for a good reason, because achieving key educational attainment benchmarks is highly predictive of a wide variety of positive life outcomes. So it's really a big deal if an education intervention increases educational attainment. There have been 12 studies of the effects of private school choice on educational attainment outcomes. And we see that although 3 of those 12 findings are of no significant effects of choice on outcomes, there are no findings of negative effects. And 9 of the studies find their main finding is that participation in private school choice increases the likelihood of educational attainment by substantial amounts. And I think what's most important is if you look at the 4 studies of the effect of school choice on achieving a bachelor's degree from a 4-year college or university, all of those show statistically significant positive effects of degree attainment. And college degree attainment is really the holy grail of the educational system. The more low-income inner-city kids, because most of the participants in these studies are low-income inner-city kids, the more of them we can get to college degree attainment, the better their lives are going to be. So the results on attainment are decidedly more positive. They tilt decidedly more positive than the results on achievement. So let's look at the effects of private school choice on civic outcomes. This is a photo from a school board meeting. And the person at the podium is a domestic terrorist. He's a concerned parent. It's easy to confuse the two. But basically, we know that central to the argument about private school choice is the question of the importance of government-run private schools to the formation of citizens. Many choice opponents argue that government-run public schools are necessary to promote civic values and the public purposes of education, and that private schools are inherently privatizing institutions that neglect citizen formation. So that raises the question, do government-run public schools consistently and dramatically outperform private schools in enhancing civic values such as tolerance, political participation, political knowledge, and voluntarism? So what I've done is I've assembled the 93 statistical findings on this question of the effect of private school choice or private schooling on civic outcomes. And we see that 56 of those findings are that private schooling has a statistically significant positive effect on student civic outcomes. 34 of the findings are that private schools do as well as government-run public schools in promoting the citizenship virtues that I just mentioned. And only 3 of the 93 findings are of a public schooling advantage in forming citizens. Finally, let's look at the competitive effects of private school choice. This is the dispute over whether opening up, launching private school choice programs or expanding them is going to send affected public schools down a cycle of decay, or whether competition from choice will lead to better achievement outcomes for the students who remain behind in public schools. And we find that the latter is the case. Now, there are actually 29 empirical studies of the competitive effects of private school choice. I can't fit them all on a single slide. So here I just focus on the studies of the 2 venues that have been studied the most regarding this question, and that is the various programs in the state of Florida and the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program. So in those 17 studies, we see a couple of sets of findings that are like neutral to positive, and the rest are all pretty clearly positive. The one study of Florida found consistently null effects, but generally a lot of positive findings. And if we look at the other 12 studies that aren't on this slide, 11 of them report positive effects of competition on student performance for the students who remain in public schools. Only one showed a null effect, that is of the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program. And I left that one off this slide, not because it was an aberrant null finding, but because it was co-authored by Marcus Winters. And I don't want to spoil Marcus with any additional attention. So I left that one out. So in conclusion, choice programs are spreading and growing across the country. Most of the outcomes are positive. The achievement effects really are mixed, especially recently and in math. The attainment effects are largely positive. The civic effects are overwhelmingly positive, and the competitive effects are almost universally positive. So thank you, and go Hogs, beat the Crimson Tide.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Pat. Why don't we turn to the Q&A now? I think, Paul, would you like to get it started?
Well, I do have a question that I'd like to, the topic I want to raise is safety. I've become interested in safety issues lately, and it may be that parents care a lot more about safety than anything else. And it may be that they have much more information about safety at school than anything else. So, Chris, I want to ask you first, do you think that there's anything about peer group there that could be affecting your results, that if you can move to a school where you're safer, that may, your achievement, you have a better chance of doing well at school because you're not frightened, and your parents can feel more confident and life is going to be better. And principals know this. You mentioned that the principal may be the driving force here, and the principal can't do much about how teachers teach in the classroom, perhaps, but they can have a lot to do with safety at the school, the hallways and playgrounds and lots of other things. So I know this is speculative, but you think that this could be part of what's going on in your study?
Yeah, that's a great question. So recently, this past fall, so like 2 months ago or this fall, I administered a survey to the most recent cohort of zones of choice parents. And one of the questions asked them, what do you prioritize when selecting schools? And the overwhelming kind of most important factor, safety, by far. Like its test scores came in number 3. And so it's definitely something that's on the minds of parents in these neighborhoods that are particularly disadvantaged. Now, related to kind of changes in safety within a zone of choice, I just don't think there's that much variation. So these schools, it's a neighborhood-based program. So the schools you gained access to aren't going to be vastly different from the one you already had access to. So although there is in each zone a relatively safer school, it's not by a significant margin. It's not like a substantial drastic change in kind of the school environment and climate. But nonetheless, I think given the survey evidence, it is definitely something on the minds of parents and could be playing a role for sure.
So I'll ask that same question of Marcus, because you talk about preferences, maybe preferences are the skies for this, this factor of safety.
I mean, my guess would definitely be that the safety goes into that preferences, into parents' preferences there, right? It's not something that we could really directly analyze in the Newark area. I mean, but that said, like I'd be surprised if there wasn't, a relationship there. I mean, from our perspective, I'm not sure how much, I mean, and going to a safer school, I would probably expect to keep you in there as well. How much that could drive our results, I'm not exactly sure, but it's part of the kind of, overall kind of what the school provides, I think, right? And you can build that in with, in the safety of things. I think there's also related to that safety is the issue of kind of just the school's culture and what can be, offered within the school. And I think that, a lot of charter schools, the highly effective charter schools would say that that's something that they invest very heavily in. And I think that's gonna, show up in the, in their overall results. And it's, I'd be surprised if it wasn't part of why they're highly preferred, and definitely having safe environments is going to lead to higher performance as well. We're not really in a spot where we can really draw that out in the data.
So finally, Pat, you emphasize achievement versus enrollment, and enrollment effects are much stronger for the choice school. But again, could it be that choice schools don't provide so much a difference in how much a student has been given a chance to learn as creating a safe environment so that they can stay within the educational system and persist longer within it?
Sure, Paul. I definitely think that's part of what's driving this disconnect between the achievement effects and the attainment effects of choice programs. That basically kids who participate in choice programs are staying engaged in the educational project longer than control and comparison students are. When Tom Stewart and I co-authored a book called The School Choice Journey, where we did a series of longitudinal focus groups with participants in the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program. And it was really kind of interesting because we probed them on this question, that Chris brought up about what is the main motivation for your choice of school. And in the third year of these focus groups, the parents said overwhelmingly academic quality. And so we informed them, this was like the same panel of parents followed over time. We informed them that the first year, they overwhelmingly said safety was their number one concern. And there was this woman in the front row, and she shouted, yes, of course, that's because now they're safe. Once they're safe, we can focus on school quality. And I just wanted to say, thank you, Mrs. Abraham Maslow, because her grasp of the situation was exactly consistent with Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. I mean, if a parent has a child in an unsafe school, of course, their central focus is getting them to an environment that's safe. And if a kid's in an unsafe school, they want to get out. I mean, they don't want to go to school. And so it creates this disengagement with the educational project that choice programs can disconnect and can diffuse and get kids in an environment where they feel safer, they're more comfortable, and they can learn more, hopefully.
All right. Well, it seems like Chris's results with respect to competitive effects quite positive. Pat, you also presented largely positive results. I'm wondering, because oftentimes I'll being in a college of education, have an opportunity to talk with principals, district leaders, and you'll often hear that we're doing everything we can. Additional competition is not going to incentivize us. We're dealing with lots of challenges. All of our resources are already kind of strained to the max. So do you have any insights as to what is happening on the ground? So what are the mechanisms? Do we have any evidence of the mechanisms that might be underlying these results?
So I'll go first, and then Chris, can build. There are only a couple of studies of the mechanisms behind these competitive effects. They seem to suggest, number one, public schools communicate more frequently and more substantively with parents when they face competition. So there's an information exchange and a communication that's enhanced. And that can have positive spillover effects on student achievement. So that's a factor. Another factor is they tend to launch new programs that are targeted to appeal to the students they feel they are at greatest risk of losing. So there is generally an enhancement of their educational program geared toward holding on to students, and that could be behind some of the positive achievement effects. And the third thing that seems to happen in some of these schools is they actually get rid of their lowest performing classroom teachers, which of course is extremely hard to do in the public school system under normal circumstances. It requires a great deal of commitment by principals and administrators to cut loose a low performing teacher, but the public schools are more likely to do it when they face competition from choice.
So we have a question here for Chris about the ZOC program. Whether or not enrollment dropped at schools that were apparently lower performing. You see some that they're losing revenue if they don't have as many students. How much you didn't emphasize that in your presentation, but could that be going on, or why is
Yeah,
that?
so in the paper, we actually look at that directly. And so what we find is that kind of changes in school value added closely track changes in enrollment. So what happened within each zone of choice on average is that the lower performing school in the zone suffered a negative enrollment shock in the first year and the second year of the program. And then you see their value added start improving and the kind of enrollment starts catching up. In the most recent year that we had data for, kind of the enrollment kind of went back to kind of pre-ZOZ levels, but the value added had also converged. So if you consider that an adequate measure of school quality, kind of school quality within zones seem to have converged. So there's no longer a lower performing school. They seem to be performing similarly on average. And that was closely tracked by enrollment. So parents were choosing schools in a systematic way that kind of indicated they preferred attributes that were strongly correlated with value added. And so we saw that directly in the preference data and enrollment shares, things like that.
And Chris, I just wanted to clarify something. So is your hypothesis that the limited choice set that parents have in this case kind of makes it easier to engage in more informed choice? And so the result is that you actually have intensified competition because parents are essentially better informed. Is that how you're interpreting these results?
So I think it's a combination of the limited choice set and the fact that you have field administrators that are also kind of on the ground communicating and reaching out to parents and making sure they're also engaged in the school choice process. If those administrators weren't there, I don't think we would have found the same results. So this fall, I ran a survey, and this is before the field administrators make contact with the parents. And I asked parents if they had heard about the Zones of Choice program, and roughly 75% of them responded that they had not. And so this program has existed for 8 years. So in these disadvantaged neighborhoods, unless you have some administrators ensuring people are informed about the school options nearby, they're probably not going to know about it. So to me, that was some pretty compelling evidence suggesting that the field administrators playing a big role. But also, I think the choice set is playing a role as well, because principals know who they're being compared to. They know it's just 3 or 4 principals that kind of they can potentially communicate with, as opposed to being compared to hundreds of principals across LAUSD. So I think the choice set margin is playing a role. It's hard for me to quantify that, but it's something that's worth exploring maybe into the future.
So let me ask you all how much you think the pandemic has changed the context for school choice. Most of these studies that you're referring to are for a period that precedes the pandemic. Is this just all out-of-date research and the landscape has totally changed, or are we going to see a return to normalcy or somewhere in between? So Marcus, why don't we begin with you?
I mean, the short answer is everything's changed, right? And in a way that's going to be frustrating for us as researchers for a little while too, right? Like, how long is it going to be until we really believe some of the test scores and we get, you know, information on all the students and the like? I mean, my suspicion is, like, I mean, I guess speaking on the charter school side, is that my suspicion is that the world hasn't changed dramatically for charters relative to public schools due to the pandemic. I think it's obviously impacted everyone, but as so much directly like a form of public school choice. And they were already, at least in the areas where they're heavily oversubscribed, they've been heavily oversubscribed, and like, so it'd be kind of hard to have those additional impacts on there. But I mean, obviously that's going to be interesting to see. I mean, on the private school side, I do think it's going to be especially interesting to see how many students come back. I mean, in my kids' school district, I think we're all kind of looking and seeing like how many parents are coming back and how much of what we've seen in the private sector is going to keep going on. I don't think it's fair to say that things are out of date, because I do think that we are still like, where there's the applied what's going on with specific programs, but also there's just the larger questions of, you know, what does the world look like with school choice, and you know, are these decisions being made, and which I think are kind of fundamental principles that should carry over. But I think it's fair to say, for me, especially on the private school side, I'm interested to see what happens in the next little while.
Well, you're the expert, Pat, on the private school side. So what's your take on that?
Well, I think, Paul, what's happening is there's this sort of blending of homeschooling and private schooling that's taken place with the launch of micro schools and the like, and pandemic pods. And so, you know, the whole definition of what is private schooling is getting blurred. If we combine the market share of brick and mortar private schools and homeschools, just under a general umbrella of non-public schooling, you know, that market share was about 12% before the pandemic, and it's about 15% now. So a lot of the 3% shift, you could say almost entirely the 3% shift out of district-run public schools, has gone to or been accounted for by growth in that combined category of private, homeschool, and sort of every blended form in between. And that's why the education savings account model, I think, is so important going forward for private school choice programs. I think the new programs are largely going to be designed as ESAs, and I think some of the existing programs are going to be reformed into ESAs, because that gives parents maximum flexibility to customize their child's education. And coming out of COVID, a lot of parents see great value in that ability to customize.
And Chris, how about Los Angeles? Are you seeing a declining enrollment in Los Angeles that's been reported for New York City? Some people are saying in New York City, it's even more dramatic than has been publicly reported, and the numbers are only going to get worse. What's your assessment as to how that's affecting things in the part of Los Angeles that you're looking at, and more generally?
So on top of an enrollment shock, which has also been pretty severe in LA, LAUSD now has a new school called the City of Angels Academy, and that is their remote kind of option. And roughly 15,000 families opted to enroll their kids in the remote option, which is roughly 3% of the kids in LAUSD. And it seems like that's going to be something persistent that exists into the long run. And so a lot of families seem to be opting for alternative schooling options that are kind of more remote friendly. in the public school sector. That's excluding other families that may have left the district, part of the enrollment shock. But even among those that stayed within, roughly 3% prefer remote schooling at the moment. And so that's something that they're navigating and having struggles with staffing. The last time I had conversations with them. So it's kind of hard to just, I don't know, have this new large school and kind of staff it. So it'll be interesting how that develops into the future. That's as much as I know.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris. It looks like we've reached the end of the hour. So thank you very much to Chris and Marcus and Pat for 3 highly informative presentations. I do want to just note to the audience that we'll be taking a week off for Thanksgiving, and then we'll be returning on December 3rd, and we'll have Alberto Carvalho from Miami-Dade County Public Schools, and also Michael Hinojosa from Dallas Independent, and Robin Lake from the Center on Reinventing Public Education in 2 weeks. So again, we'll be taking a week off and returning in a couple of weeks. So thank you again to Pat, Marcus, and Chris, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
And thanks to all of you for joining us today.
Thanks very much. It was fun.